My name is Dorothy, and I am 66 years old. For 43 years, I have been a mother first, everything else second. Every extra shift I worked at the hospital after my husband's passing, every sacrifice I made every sleepless night worrying about her future, every dollar I saved was for Lisa, my only daughter. I poured my heart into her, completely provided for her education without hesitation, supported her through every setback and disappointment, always believing our bond was unbreakable, that her happiness was my ultimate reward and my greatest achievement in life. But the phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon that changed everything forever. Lisa's voice, chillingly detached and distant. Mom, Greg says you're just too much for us to handle. We're cutting ties completely. Then came Greg's sneering voice in the background, cold and calculating. Some people just can't stand on their own anymore. Within days, Karen's whispers followed, through mutual friends, painting me as unmanageable now and too much of a burden. My heart didn't just break that day. It shattered into a million pieces, each fragment cutting deeper than the last. My life's purpose, my very identity as a loving, devoted mother was brutally erased in one devastating conversation that lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet amidst the crushing despair and overwhelming darkness, a nurse's methodical mind refused to surrender completely. They didn't know about my meticulously kept health records, proving my mental clarity and competence. Nor did they know about the discreet voice recorder I'd been using for my writing workshop, which had captured Greg's venom and manipulation and Lisa's flicker of hesitation during their recent visits. My truth was hidden from them, but not lost forever. And now I would find a way to make it heard, not just for myself and my own vindication, but for Lisa and her freedom. The silence that followed that devastating phone call was deafening and suffocating. For 3 long, torturous days, I sat by my kitchen phone, staring at the faded photo of Lisa and me at her college graduation ceremony. In that cherished picture, her arms were wrapped around me tightly, her smile radiant with genuine gratitude and love. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," she had whispered that day, her voice thick with emotion. "You're my hero, my everything." Now her voice echoed in my mind with those cruel final words that had torn my world apart completely. I called her 17 times over those 3 days. 17 desperate attempts to reach my daughter, to understand what had happened to the girl who once brought me dandelions and called them sunshine flowers for my sunshine mommy. Each call went straight to voicemail, that mechanical recording becoming more painful with each repetition. My voice grew more desperate with each message. I left my composure cracking a little more each time. "Lisa, sweetheart, it's Mom. I don't understand what's happening between us. Please, just talk to me for 5 minutes. Then hours later, "Lisa, I'm so worried about you. This isn't like you at all. Something's wrong." Finally, my voice breaking completely, "Baby, I love you more than life itself. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix it together. We always have." On the 18th call, Greg answered, and his voice dripped with satisfaction, like honey laced with poison and malice. "Dorothy, Lisa doesn't want to talk to you anymore. She's made her choice, and it's final. You need to respect that decision and stop harassing us immediately." Harassing. The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I'm her mother. I have a right to speak to my own daughter. "You have no rights here whatsoever." He interrupted, his tone turning ice cold and threatening. "Lisa is an adult, and she's chosen her real family now. That's me, not some needy old woman who can't let go of the past." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking and calculated. This was the same man who had sat at my dinner table for 3 years, who had called me Mom Dorothy with what I had foolishly thought was genuine affection and respect. I had supported their relationship wholeheartedly, even when something deep in my gut warned me against him repeatedly. I had bitten my tongue when he encouraged Lisa to quit her stable, well-paying job to pursue his risky business ventures that never seemed to pan out. I had written checks when his investments failed spectacularly, never once saying, "I told you so," or making her feel bad about his failures. "Greg, please," I whispered, my voice breaking with desperation. "I love her more than anything in this world. She's all I have left." "That's your problem, not ours," he replied, with chilling detachment that sent shivers down my spine. "Lisa is building a new life now, a better life, a happier life, without baggage like you weighing her down." The line went dead, leaving me holding the phone like a lifeline to nowhere, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Within days, Karen Gregg's manipulative sister had begun her calculated campaign of destruction against my reputation. At the grocery store, where I had shopped loyally for 20 years, Mrs. Henderson, who used to chat with me enthusiastically about her grandchildren every week, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes and hurried away when she saw me approaching. At church, where I had been a faithful member for 15 years, whispers followed me down the aisle like shadows. "Poor thing," I heard someone say behind me. Lisa finally had to cut ties completely. She was becoming such an unbearable burden on that poor girl. Karen had masterfully painted me as a demanding invalid, an emotional vampire who had drained Lisa dry of energy and joy. According to her carefully crafted version of events, I was mentally declining, rapidly financially irresponsible and needy, and desperately clinging to a daughter who needed to be free to live her own life. The cruelest part was how she mixed just enough truth with her lies to make them believable. Yes, I had some arthritis that made certain tasks difficult. Yes, I sometimes asked Lisa for help with new technology that confused me. But Karen twisted these completely normal signs of aging into evidence of complete incompetence and neediness. The isolation was suffocating and absolute. Friends I had known for decades began to distance themselves, either believing Karen's malicious lies completely or simply feeling uncomfortable with the messiness of family drama. The life I had built carefully in this community, the reputation I had earned through 40 years of dedicated nursing and service, began to crumble under the weight of malicious gossip and deliberate character assassination. Then came Greg's final insult, delivered through a certified letter that felt like a legal death warrant when I opened it with shaking hands. Any further attempts to contact Lisa will be considered harassment and may result in legal action and restraining orders. Additionally, we require immediate documentation of your mental competency and financial stability to ensure you pose no burden to Lisa's future security and happiness. I stared at that letter until the words blurred through my tears of rage and disbelief. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away completely. This man, who had never worked a stable job in his entire life, was demanding proof of my competency. This man, who had lived off Lisa's income and my generous financial support for years, was questioning my financial stability with breathtaking hypocrisy. But in that moment of devastating humiliation and crushing defeat, something fundamental shifted inside me. The nurse who had spent decades advocating fiercely for patients who couldn't speak for themselves began to stir and awaken. The woman who had raised a child alone while working double shifts to pay for her education, who had never once asked for help or pity, wasn't ready to disappear quietly into the shadows of irrelevance and shame. The social media posts started appearing exactly 2 weeks after the threatening letter arrived, each one more painful than the last. Lisa radiant and laughing freely at expensive restaurants I could never afford on my fixed income. Lisa and Greg on a luxurious beach vacation, her arms around him in a way that made my heart ache with bittersweet memory. Lisa had once hugged me like that with complete trust and unconditional love when she was small and I was her whole world. Now she was living a carefree life that seemed specifically crafted to show me exactly what I was missing, what I had been excluded from. Each photograph was a dagger twisted deeper into my already wounded chest. There was Lisa wearing an expensive necklace I didn't recognize, probably a gift from Greg, bought with money that should have been saving for their future. There was Lisa at an upscale wine, tasting her face flushed with happiness and freedom I hadn't seen in months before she left so abruptly. The captions were even worse than the images themselves. Living my best life, finally. One read with deliberate cruelty. So grateful for new beginnings and fresh starts, said another, each word designed to cut me deeper. I found myself checking her social media page, obsessively torturing myself daily with evidence of her apparent joy and liberation. The Lisa in these photos looked younger, somehow unburdened and carefree in a way that made my heart break all over again. Was this the burden Greg had been talking about so coldly? Was I truly the dead weight that had been holding my beautiful daughter down all these years? The devastating realization hit me like a freight train as I sat alone in my kitchen at 3 a.m, scrolling through endless photos of my daughter's new life on my laptop screen. Greg's manipulation wasn't just complete and thorough, it was successful beyond his wildest dreams. Lisa wasn't just a victim of his psychological warfare anymore. She was a willing, enthusiastic participant in my complete abandonment and erasure from her life. My daughter, the girl I had raised to be kind and compassionate and loving, had chosen Greg's approval and promises over 43 years of a mother's unconditional love and sacrifice. She had chosen his vision of a carefree life without responsibilities over the woman who had sacrificed everything, including her own dreams and security, to give her every opportunity possible. The bitterness that rose in my throat was unlike anything I had ever tasted in my entire life. I thought about the second mortgage I had taken out 2 years ago when Greg's latest business venture failed catastrophically and they were facing foreclosure on their home. I had risked my own financial security, my own home and future to save theirs without hesitation. I hadn't told Lisa how close that decision had brought me to bankruptcy, how many meals I had skipped to make those crushing monthly payments, how many nights I had lain awake, worrying about my own future. I had wanted to protect her from worry and guilt, to let her believe that helping them was easy and effortless for me. That money was funding their luxurious new life now. My sacrifice, my near financial ruin, had bought Lisa's freedom from me and everything I represented to her. The memory that broke me completely came flooding back as I sat surrounded by the oppressive silence of my empty house. Lisa had been 19 away at college when she called me crying hysterically one night. She was pregnant and absolutely terrified. Greg, her boyfriend of only 6 months, had disappeared completely the moment she told him the news. She was alone, scared, and facing impossible choices that would shape the rest of her life. I had driven 4 hours through a dangerous snowstorm to reach her, my heart breaking with every mile as I listened to her sobbing over the phone. I had held her in my arms while she sobbed uncontrollably, had helped her think through all her options carefully, and without judgment, had supported whatever decision she made completely. When she chose to continue the pregnancy, I had been there for every doctor's appointment, I could possibly manage holding her hand and offering strength. When she miscarried at 12 weeks, I had grieved with her deeply, had helped her heal both physically and emotionally through those dark months. Greg had returned during her recovery period full of hollow apologies and empty promises that I could see right through. I had bitten my tongue then, too, watching my heartbroken daughter take him back because she desperately needed someone to love her and make her feel wanted. I had never told her what I really thought of his cowardly abandonment during her darkest hour. I had never said what I truly thought about a man who would leave a woman alone and frightened when she needed him most. Now that same selfish, manipulative man was the one she had chosen over me, the mother who had never once abandoned her or let her down. The cruelest twist came through Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, who had inadvertently become Karen's unwitting messenger and spy. Karen stopped by today. She told me over our shared fence, her voice filled with manufactured sympathy that made my skin crawl. She's so worried about Lisa, you know. She says Lisa is finally getting the peace and happiness she deserves after all these years. Karen thinks it might be best if you considered one of those nice assisted living places she knows about. She even brought some brochures for you to look at. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity and calculated cruelty. Karen was positioning herself as the concerned, caring family member while painting me as the burdensome problem that needed to be managed and removed. She was already planning my complete exile, my removal from any position where I might inconvenience their carefully constructed new narrative about Lisa's liberation. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, where Lisa had once stuck glow-in-the-dark stars when she was 7 years old, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The devastating pain was still there, would probably always be there, like a scar on my heart. But alongside it, a cold, hard clarity was forming like ice in my veins. They didn't know what they were really dealing with. They saw only a heartbroken old woman, easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. They didn't see the nurse who had fought hospital administrators fiercely for her patients' rights and dignity. They didn't see the mother who had raised a child completely alone while building a respected career and solid reputation. They didn't see the woman who had survived her husband's sudden death, crushing financial struggles, and every other challenge life had thrown at her with grace and determination. I had been playing defense for too long, reacting to their attacks, trying desperately to justify my very existence. But I was done defending myself and explaining my worth. It was time to fight back with everything I had. The final complete severance came when I tried desperately to reach Lisa through her old workplace, hoping against hope for some connection. I knew she had quit her stable job months ago at Greg's insistence, but I hoped maybe someone there would have a forwarding number, some way to reach her that Greg couldn't monitor and control. Instead, I found myself speaking to Jennifer, Lisa's former supervisor, who delivered the killing blow with uncomfortable kindness that made it somehow worse. "Oh, Dorothy, I'm so sorry about all this," Jennifer said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy that made my heart ache. Lisa called specifically to ask us not to give out any information about her whereabouts to anyone, especially family members. She said she needed to make a complete break for her mental health and emotional well-being. For my mental health. My own daughter had positioned me as such a dangerous threat to her well-being that she had to hide from me like I was some kind of deranged stalker or abusive monster. The professional courtesy in Jennifer's voice couldn't mask the pity underneath, and I knew that even Lisa's former colleagues now saw me as the problem mother who couldn't let go gracefully, who was probably losing her mind with age and loneliness. I hung up the phone with trembling hands and walked slowly to Lisa's old bedroom, a shrine I had maintained lovingly for the 3 years since she moved in with Greg. Her high school trophies still lined the shelves exactly as she had left them. Her favorite stuffed rabbit, worn soft from years of cuddles, sat on the bed waiting patiently for her return. Photo after photo covered every wall, documenting every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy and pride in her life, from birth to graduation. In one treasured picture, she was 7 years old, missing her front teeth, holding a handmade Mother's Day card she had crafted carefully at school. My mom is the best because she takes care of me when I'm sick and makes me feel better always. It read in her careful, childish handwriting that I had saved like precious treasure. In another favorite, she was 16, rolling her eyes dramatically at my camera, but smiling despite herself. Mom stopped taking pictures of everything. She had protested, but she had posed anyway because she knew it made me happy and proud to capture every moment. The devastating contrast between that laughing, loving girl and the cold stranger who had cut me out of her life completely was unbearable to contemplate. Somewhere along the way, Greg had convinced her systematically that all of this love, all of this precious history we had built together was actually a burden she needed to escape from to be truly happy. The final cruelty came at church the following Sunday, in the place where I had sought comfort and community for 15 faithful years. I had been attending the same congregation, religiously had served on committees, had brought casseroles to every funeral, and cookies to every bake sale without fail. These people had watched Lisa grow up, had celebrated her achievements. Alongside me had been my extended family when I needed support most. Karen was there, of course, holding court near the coffee table after service, like a queen surrounded by her subjects. Her voice carried clearly across the fellowship hall, every word intended for my ears and calculated for maximum damage. It's really tragic, but sometimes the kindest thing a child can do is set firm boundaries with aging parents, she announced loudly. Lisa is just absolutely blooming now that she doesn't have to manage her mother's constant neediness and emotional demands. Some people just can't handle aging gracefully, you know. They become so desperate for attention and control. The women around her nodded sympathetically, shooting glances in my direction that mixed pity with relief that they weren't in Lisa's impossible position. I stood frozen by the bulletin board, pretending to read announcements I had already memorized, while my reputation and dignity were systematically shredded in front of people I had considered friends and allies for years. But it was when I got home that afternoon that the most devastating realization of all hit me like a physical blow. As I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant suffocating companion, a memory surfaced that I had buried deep for 37 long years, a secret I had never shared with another living soul. Lisa had been 6 years old when she collapsed suddenly during a family picnic, her small body crumpling to the ground without warning. What everyone thought was just fatigue from playing too hard in the summer heat turned out to be something much more serious and life-threatening. The emergency room doctors found a mass near her heart, something that required immediate surgery and a long, uncertain recovery with no guarantees. The surgeon, Dr. Williams, had been brutally honest about the risks we faced. There was a very real chance we could lose her forever. But there was something else, something I had never told anyone, not even my beloved husband, who had held my hand through those terrifying weeks. During the extensive pre-surgical testing, they had discovered that Lisa had an extremely rare blood type that made finding compatible donors nearly impossible. The delicate surgery would require multiple transfusions, and the blood bank was critically low on her specific type, with no other donors available. I was a match, not just a close match, but a perfect genetic match that could save her life. However, the amount of blood they desperately needed would be dangerous for me to donate all at once, potentially life-threatening, given my smaller size and existing anemia. Dr. Williams had explained carefully that they could take what they safely could from me and supplement with synthetic alternatives, but the synthetic blood carried significantly higher risks for complications during such delicate heart surgery on such a small child. I made a choice that could have killed me without hesitation. I insisted they take whatever they needed from me, even far beyond the safe limits they had established. I didn't care about the risk to myself. All that mattered was saving my daughter's life, no matter the cost to my own. I spent 3 critical days in the hospital myself, recovering from severe anemia, while watching my daughter fight for her life in the room next door, never knowing if either of us would survive. Lisa's surgery was successful. She recovered completely, grew up healthy and strong and beautiful, never knowing that her mother's blood literally flowed through her veins, that her mother had risked everything to give her life a second chance when medical science couldn't provide what she needed. Now that same daughter whose life I had saved through my own sacrifice, whose education I had funded through extra shifts and crushing loans, whose dreams I had supported even when they led her to a man who would eventually turn her against me, had declared me a burden too heavy to bear in her new life. The irony was devastating and complete. The girl whose life I had saved through my own blood, my own near-death sacrifice, had chosen to see me as the problem that needed to be eliminated from her existence. But in that moment of complete despair and crushing defeat, something crystallized inside me with perfect clarity. This wasn't just about my pain anymore, as deep and real as it was. This was about Lisa's freedom and her very soul. Greg had stolen my daughter as surely as if he had kidnapped her physically, but he had done it with psychological manipulation so complete and thorough that she couldn't see the prison he had built around her mind and heart. I walked slowly to my desk and pulled out the voice recorder I had been using faithfully for my writing workshop. On it were hours of conversations from the months before they left, including several revealing moments where Greg's carefully constructed mask had slipped and his true nature had shown through clearly. I had Lisa's voice too captured in moments when she had expressed serious doubts about their relationship concerns, about his treatment of me, questions about whether she was making the right choices for her future. They thought they had silenced me, completely isolated me from any support, removed me from Lisa's life forever. They thought I was just a broken old woman who would fade away quietly into irrelevance and shame, never to trouble them again. They were wrong. I was a mother who had saved her daughter's life once before through my own blood and sacrifice, and I was going to do it again with everything I had left. This time, I wouldn't be saving her from a failing heart. I would be saving her from a failing relationship with a man who was slowly, systematically destroying everything good and pure in her. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and I had more weapons than they knew. The morning after my devastating realization about the blood transfusion, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The crushing weight of grief was still there, pressing down on my chest like a physical burden, but alongside it was something new and powerful: purpose. For the first time since that terrible phone call, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I made my coffee slowly, deliberately, the way I had every morning for the past 40 years. But this morning was different. This morning, I wasn't just surviving another day of heartbreak. I was preparing for battle, and I had weapons they didn't even know existed. My first stop was the filing cabinet in my home office, the one Lisa used to tease me about because of my obsessive organization. "Mom, you keep records of everything." She would laugh, shaking her head at my meticulously labeled folders. That same careful documentation was about to become my salvation. With trembling hands but fierce determination burning in my chest, I pulled out my health records folder. Page after page of documented evidence, cross-referenced and perfectly organized dating back 5 years. Every doctor's visit, every blood test, every cognitive assessment, every prescription, all meticulously recorded in my own careful handwriting alongside the official medical documents. Dr. Peterson's most recent evaluation was particularly damning to their narrative. Patient demonstrates excellent cognitive function, sharp memory recall, and sound judgment. No signs of mental decline or impairment. Highly capable of independent living and decision-making. The date stamp was just 3 months old, well after Karen had begun spreading her malicious rumors about my supposed mental deterioration. My blood pressure readings were normal. My cholesterol levels were better than most people half my age. My recent mammogram and bone density tests showed a woman in remarkably good health for her age. Every single test, every single evaluation, painted a picture of competence and independence that completely refuted Karen's character assassination campaign. But the health records were just the beginning. My hand shook slightly as I reached for what looked like an ordinary bedside clock radio, the one I'd been using for my writing workshop sessions. I had purchased it specifically because it had a hidden recording function, something I discovered by accident when trying to record myself practicing the stories I was writing. The recordings were damning beyond anything I had dared to hope for. Hours and hours of conversations from the months before they left, captured with crystal clear audio quality. I had been using it to record my writing practice sessions, but it had been running during their visits, capturing everything. Greg's voice filled my kitchen as I played back the recordings, his manipulation laid bare in his own words. "She's becoming such a burden, Lisa. Look at how dependent she's getting. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life taking care of an old woman who can't even figure out her smartphone?" Then Lisa's voice, uncertain and conflicted. "But Mom has always been so independent. She's not that bad, Greg. Maybe we're being too harsh." "That's exactly what she wants you to think." Greg's voice continued, smooth and convincing. "It starts small, but before you know it, you'll be changing her diapers and feeding her by hand. Is that the life you want? Or do you want to build something beautiful with me? Somewhere fresh where we can just be happy?" The recordings captured moment after moment of his systematic erosion of Lisa's confidence in me, his deliberate cultivation of guilt and fear. He painted pictures of a future where Lisa would be trapped, sacrificing her own happiness to care for a demanding, declining mother. He made my normal requests for help with technology sound like evidence of incompetence. He twisted my expressions of love into emotional manipulation. Most heartbreaking of all were Lisa's moments of doubt and resistance, quickly bulldozed by Greg's relentless pressure. "I don't know, Greg. She sacrificed so much for me. How can I just abandon her?" Only to have him respond with psychological manipulation so skilled, it took my breath away. "The fact that you feel guilty proves how unhealthy this relationship is. Healthy families don't use guilt as a weapon." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Greg and Lisa were continuing to build their new life, blissfully unaware that their carefully constructed narrative was about to crumble. Their social media posts continued to paint a picture of perfect happiness and freedom. Greg had even posted a cryptic message about toxic family dynamics and the courage to break free from generational trauma. Words that made my stomach turn with their calculated cruelty. Karen had grown even bolder in her campaign against me, apparently convinced that their victory was complete and irreversible. Just yesterday, she had cornered poor Mrs. Patterson again, this time suggesting that I might need professional intervention because I was clearly not coping well with abandonment. She had even brought up the possibility of a welfare check, painting herself as the concerned community member worried about my mental state. They had no idea that their own words, their own admissions of manipulation and malice were sitting in my kitchen digitally preserved and ready to destroy the lies they had built their new life upon. They thought they had silenced me permanently, reduced me to a broken old woman who would fade away into irrelevance and shame. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The nurse who had spent decades fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves was far from finished. The mother who had saved her daughter's life with her own blood wasn't going to let that daughter remain trapped in a web of lies and manipulation. I sat back in my chair, surrounded by irrefutable evidence of the truth they had tried so hard to bury. For the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not just hope for vindication, but hope for Lisa's freedom from the psychological prison Greg had built around her mind. The recordings proved everything: Greg's deliberate manipulation, Lisa's coercion, and internal conflict, Karen's role in spreading malicious lies, my own competence and mental clarity. Everything I needed to expose the truth and potentially save my daughter from a man who was systematically destroying her relationship with everyone who truly loved her. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming not just my own reputation, but my daughter's future. Tonight, I would plan my strategy with the care and precision that had made me an excellent nurse for 4 decades. They had underestimated me completely, and that would be their downfall. The Silver Writers Workshop met every Thursday morning in the basement of the Riverside Community Center, a place I had driven past countless times, but never thought to enter. 3 weeks after discovering my evidence, I found myself climbing down those familiar concrete steps, my heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and desperate hope. The group was smaller than I had expected, maybe 8 people scattered around a circle of mismatched chairs. The facilitator, a woman named Margaret with kind eyes and silver hair, welcomed me warmly. "We're so glad you decided to join us, Dorothy. Writing can be incredibly healing, especially during difficult times. I had come hoping to find a safe space to process my pain through words, but what I found was something far more valuable. 2 people in that circle would change the trajectory of my fight in ways I never could have imagined." Robert Chen sat quietly in the corner, a man in his early 70s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When Margaret asked us to introduce ourselves and share what brought us to writing, Robert's story made my pulse quicken. "I'm Robert, retired from the Tribune after 40 years of investigative journalism. I'm writing my memoirs now, but honestly, I miss the thrill of exposing injustice and helping people who've been wronged." Across from him sat Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman about my age, with gentle hands and a voice that immediately put people at ease. "I'm recently retired from my therapy practice," she explained. "I specialized in family trauma, particularly cases involving narcissistic abuse and parental alienation. I'm hoping writing will help me process some of the difficult cases I've handled over the years." When my turn came, my voice shook as I tried to find the right words. "I'm Dorothy, and I'm here because I need to find my voice again. My daughter has been taken from me through manipulation and lies. I don't know if writing can help, but I need to do something." The room fell silent, and I saw something shift in both Robert's and Dr. Sharma's expressions. After the session ended, they approached me together, their faces filled with professional interest and genuine compassion. "Dorothy," Dr. Sharma said gently, "would you be comfortable sharing more about your situation? What you described sounds very familiar to cases I've worked with." Over coffee at the diner next door, I found myself telling them everything. The manipulation, the abandonment, Karen's campaign of lies, my isolation from friends and community. I showed them my health records, the clear documentation of my mental acuity and physical independence. And then, with hands that trembled only slightly, I played them selected portions of the recordings. Robert's reporter instincts kicked in immediately. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp with professional interest. "Dorothy, this is textbook elder emotional abuse through proxy manipulation. The evidence you have here is extraordinary. Not just the recordings, but the systematic nature of the campaign against you." Dr. Sharma nodded, her expression grave. "I've seen this pattern dozens of times in my practice. The isolation, the character assassination, the financial exploitation through the second mortgage you mentioned. This man has studied techniques of psychological control, whether consciously or instinctively. The recordings are particularly damning." Robert continued, pulling out a small notebook and beginning to take notes. "They show clear evidence of coercive control and parental alienation. This isn't just a family dispute. This is documented psychological abuse." For the first time in months, I felt the overwhelming relief of being believed, of having my experience validated by experts who understood exactly what I was facing. These weren't just kind strangers offering empty sympathy. These were professionals who recognized the patterns and had the skills to help me fight back effectively. Dr. Sharma explained the psychological tactics Greg had used with clinical precision. He's isolated her from her primary attachment figure, that's you, by reframing your love as burden and your needs as unreasonable. He's created a false narrative where caring for family equals sacrifice of personal happiness. It's a classic technique used by manipulative partners to cut their victims off from support systems. Robert was already thinking strategically. "The beauty of your evidence is that it's objective. These aren't emotional accusations or he said, she said arguments. You have documented medical proof of your competence, and you have Greg's own words proving his manipulation. That's journalistic gold." Together, we began to develop a comprehensive strategy. Dr. Sharma would help me craft letters to Lisa that would be designed to penetrate the psychological barriers Greg had erected using techniques that had proven successful in other alienation cases. These wouldn't be emotional pleas, but carefully constructed presentations of fact that would force Lisa to confront the contradictions in the narrative she had accepted. Robert would begin investigating the broader pattern of Greg's behavior, looking for other potential victims or previous relationships that might show a history of manipulative conduct. He would also help me organize my evidence into a compelling narrative that could be presented publicly if necessary. "The key," Robert explained, "is to build an irrefutable case that even Greg's supporters can't dismiss. We need to show pattern motive and concrete evidence of harm. What you've given us is a starting point, but we need to be thorough and professional in our approach." Dr. Sharma added, "And we need to be prepared for escalation. When people like Greg feel their control being threatened, they often become more aggressive in their tactics. We need to document everything and be ready for attempts to discredit you further. Over the following weeks, our Thursday coffee meetings became intensive strategy sessions. Robert taught me how to organize evidence like a professional investigator, creating timelines and cross-referencing events. Dr. Sharma helped me understand the psychological aspects of what Lisa was experiencing, giving me hope that my daughter could still be reached despite the depth of Greg's influence. Most importantly, they gave me something I had lost completely. They gave me hope that this fight wasn't hopeless, that love and truth could still triumph over manipulation and lies. For the first time since that devastating phone call, I began to believe that I might actually get my daughter back. The evidence was strong. The strategy was sound. And now I had allies who understood exactly what we were up against and how to win. Under Dr. Sharma's careful guidance, I spent 2 weeks crafting what would become the most important letters of my life. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, designed to slip past Greg's psychological barriers and reach the daughter I knew was still buried somewhere beneath his manipulation. The first letter was the hardest to write, my hands shaking as I tried to find the perfect balance between love and facts. Dr. Sharma had been clear about the approach. No accusations, no emotional manipulation, no guilt, just documented facts and expressions of love. Let the truth speak for itself. Aima, my dearest Lisa. I began the words flowing from my heart onto paper with careful restraint. I hope this letter finds you healthy and at peace. I want you to know that I have never stopped loving you, and I never will regardless of what has happened between us. I included copies of my recent medical evaluations, letting Dr. Peterson's professional assessment speak for itself. I thought you might want to know that my recent health checkup showed excellent cognitive function and no signs of mental decline. Dr. Peterson noted that I demonstrate sharp memory recall and sound judgment, and that I'm highly capable of independent living. The genius of Dr. Sharma's approach was in how she had me reference the recorded conversations without revealing their existence. I've been reflecting on our conversations before you moved, particularly the one where you expressed concern about feeling pressured to choose between your relationship and your family. I want you to know that no choice should ever feel that final or that painful. I sent the letter via certified mail, my heart pounding as I watched the postal worker attach the tracking number. For 3 days, I checked the delivery status obsessively, and when it showed delivered, I felt a mixture of hope and terror. What would Lisa think when she read it? Would she recognize the truth in my words? Or had Greg's influence become too complete? The answer came sooner than I expected, but not in the way I had hoped. Through Mrs. Patterson, I learned that Greg had been seen at their mailbox the day the letter arrived, and later that evening, neighbors had noticed what looked like documents being burned in their backyard fire pit. But Dr. Sharma had prepared me for this possibility. Even if she doesn't read them completely, the mere fact that you're reaching out with documented evidence will create cognitive dissonance. Seeds of doubt, once planted, have a way of growing even in hostile soil. I continued sending letters, each one presenting different pieces of evidence, different perspectives on what had happened. I included newspaper clippings of community events I had participated in, showing my continued engagement and competence. I shared updates about mutual friends who asked about her, demonstrating that our social circle hadn't forgotten her or believed the lies about my supposed decline. Meanwhile, Karen's overconfidence was beginning to work in my favor in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Emboldened by what she saw as their complete victory, she had begun to elaborate on her stories about my supposed mental decline, adding details that contradicted her earlier versions. At the grocery store, she told Mrs. Henderson that I had been found wandering the neighborhood in my nightgown, confused and disoriented. But Mrs. Henderson had seen me that same evening, fully dressed and coherent, tending to my garden. The contradiction was small, but it planted a seed of doubt. At church, Karen claimed I had been calling people at all hours, rambling incoherently about conspiracies. But several congregation members remembered my lucid, articulate comments during recent Bible study sessions. Again, the stories didn't match the reality they had witnessed. Robert, meanwhile, had been quietly conducting his own investigation into Greg's background. What he found was disturbing but useful. Greg had a pattern of relationships where partners gradually became isolated from their families and friends. His previous girlfriend had filed a restraining order against him for emotional abuse, though she had later dropped it and moved out of state. This isn't his first rodeo, Robert told me during one of our coffee meetings. He's done this before, and he's gotten away with it because his victims were too isolated and demoralized to fight back effectively. You're different, Dorothy. You have evidence and you have support. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Linda Morrison, a woman I barely knew from church, approached me after service one Sunday with a troubled expression. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you feeling all right? Karen has been saying some things that just don't match what I see when I talk to you. What kind of things, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Linda looked uncomfortable but determined. She's been saying you're having memory problems and getting confused about things. But when we talked last week about the church fundraiser, you remembered every detail from the planning meetings I had missed. It just doesn't add up. That conversation led to others. Quietly, carefully, some members of our community began to question the narrative Karen had been so aggressively promoting. They started paying closer attention to our interactions, noticing the discrepancy between Karen's claims and my actual behavior. The tide was beginning to turn slowly but perceptibly. People who had been avoiding me out of discomfort began to engage again, testing Karen's claims against their own observations. My decades of service to this community, my years of competent nursing, my reputation for reliability and honesty were beginning to outweigh the malicious gossip. But the most important change was one I couldn't see directly. According to Robert's careful investigation, there were signs that Lisa was beginning to show cracks in her submission to Greg's narrative. A former coworker had spotted her at a coffee shop, looking troubled and distracted, staring at her phone for long periods. Another mutual friend had tried to approach her at a shopping center, only to have Lisa hurry away, but not before the friend noticed tears in her eyes. The letters were having an impact, even if Lisa wasn't responding directly. The documented evidence was creating the cognitive dissonance Dr. Sharma had predicted. Somewhere in my daughter's mind, the truth was beginning to struggle against the lies she had been fed. Greg might have been controlling her communication, burning my letters before she could fully process them, but he couldn't burn the doubt that was beginning to grow in her heart. The foundation of his manipulation was starting to crack, and soon those cracks would become fractures that even his skilled psychological control couldn't repair. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would force everything into the open, and I was finally ready for that battle. After 6 weeks of unanswered letters and growing community doubt, I sat across from Robert in our usual diner booth, my coffee growing cold as I wrestled with the most difficult decision of my life. The evidence was overwhelming. My allies were prepared, and Karen's credibility was crumbling under the weight of her own contradictions. The time for private appeals had passed. Are you absolutely certain about this, Dorothy? Robert asked his reporter's notebook open, but his pen still. Once this story goes public, there's no taking it back. Greg will escalate his tactics, and Lisa will be forced to confront truths she's been hiding from herself. I thought about my daughter, probably hundreds of miles away, living a life built on lies and manipulation. I thought about the blood transfusion that had saved her life 37 years ago, my blood flowing through her veins, even as she rejected everything I represented. Most of all, I thought about the recordings of her voice, the moments of doubt and conflict that proved the real Lisa was still in there somewhere fighting to be heard. "She's my daughter," I said quietly, my voice steady with resolve. If there's any chance this could free her from his control, I have to try. Even if she hates me for it initially, even if it destroys any hope of reconciliation, I can't let her remain trapped in his web of lies. Robert nodded and began writing. Over the next week, he conducted additional interviews, verified every fact, and cross-referenced every piece of evidence. Dr. Sharma provided professional context about parental alienation and psychological manipulation. The article that emerged was devastating in its clarity and impossible to dismiss. The systematic isolation of Dorothy Mackenzie. A case study in elder emotional abuse ran on the front page of the Tribune's Sunday edition and simultaneously appeared on their widely read online platform. Robert had crafted it with the skill of 40 years in investigative journalism, presenting the facts with clinical precision while allowing the emotional truth to speak for itself. The article began with my medical records, the documented proof of my mental acuity and physical independence that completely contradicted Karen's malicious narrative. It included quotes from the recordings, though Robert carefully protected the source, presenting them as documented conversations that revealed the systematic nature of Greg's manipulation. Audio evidence obtained by this reporter reveals a pattern of psychological manipulation designed to isolate an elderly woman from her only child, Robert wrote. The recordings capture Greg Morrison's deliberate efforts to reframe normal family interactions as burdensome and his systematic campaign to convince Lisa Mackenzie that caring for her mother would destroy her chances for happiness. The article included testimonials from community members who had witnessed Karen's contradictory claims about my supposed decline. It featured Dr. Sharma's professional analysis of the alienation tactics employed. Most damaging of all, it included information about Greg's previous relationship and the restraining order that painted a pattern of emotional abuse and control. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone began ringing before 8 a.m, friends and neighbors calling to express their outrage and support. Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door with tears in her eyes, apologizing for doubting me. The church pastor called to invite me to lunch, clearly uncomfortable about how quickly the congregation had accepted Karen's lies. But it was the online response that truly revealed the power of Robert's careful journalism. The article was shared thousands of times within hours with comments from readers who recognized similar patterns in their own families. Adult children began sharing their own stories of partners who had isolated them from their parents. Elder abuse advocates posted links with information about resources for families facing similar situations. 300 miles away, Greg and Lisa's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. According to Robert's sources, Greg had been frantically calling newspaper editors and threatening legal action, but his threats were hollow. Every fact in the article was meticulously documented and verified. His own recorded words were the most damning evidence of all. Lisa's reaction was harder to track, but signs of her distress began to emerge through social media monitoring that Robert had discreetly arranged. Her usual cheerful posts stopped abruptly the day the article appeared. Friends who tried to contact her reported that her phone was going straight to voicemail. Most tellingly, Greg's posts became increasingly defensive and aggressive, suggesting that Lisa was no longer the compliant partner in their narrative. Karen's world crumbled even faster than Greg's. Confronted with documented evidence that exposed her lies, she found herself socially isolated in the same community where she had once held court. Mrs. Patterson later told me that Karen had packed up and left town within a week of the article's publication, unable to face the neighbors, who now knew the truth about her character assassination campaign. The most profound impact was on Lisa herself, though I wouldn't learn the full extent until much later. According to Dr. Sharma, who had worked with similar cases, the public exposure of systematic manipulation creates what psychologists call cognitive earthquake. The victim is forced to confront the contradictions between their manipulated reality and objective truth, often leading to a complete psychological crisis as they struggle to reconcile what they've believed with what they now know to be true. Robert's sources suggested that Lisa had locked herself in their apartment for days after the article appeared, refusing to speak to Greg and declining to go to work. The perfect life they had been posting about on social media revealed itself to be as carefully constructed and false as everything else about their relationship. But Greg wasn't finished fighting. True to Dr. Sharma's predictions about escalation, he began a desperate campaign to discredit the article and me personally. He hired a lawyer to send threatening letters to the Tribune claiming defamation and demanding a retraction. He reached out to anyone who would listen, claiming I was mentally unstable and had fabricated evidence. He even tried to suggest that I had somehow doctored the audio recordings, though technical analysis quickly proved their authenticity. His most desperate move was attempting to position Lisa as his fellow victim, claiming that I had abused and manipulated her throughout her childhood, and that he had simply helped her escape a toxic situation. But this narrative crumbled under the weight of too much contrary evidence. Too many people remembered Lisa and me together, remembered the obvious love and healthy relationship we had shared for decades. The article had accomplished everything we had hoped for and more. Greg's manipulation was exposed, Karen's lies were revealed, and Lisa was finally forced to confront the truth about what had been done to both of us. The question now was whether my daughter would find the strength to break free from the psychological prison that had been built around her mind, or whether Greg's control would prove too complete to overcome. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, reading the hundreds of supportive comments from strangers who had recognized our story in their own lives, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just hope, but confidence. The truth was finally in the open, and truth had a power that all of Greg's manipulation couldn't overcome. The battle for my daughter's freedom had begun in earnest, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I believed we could win. The response to Robert's article exceeded every expectation we had dared to hold. Within 24 hours, the online version had been shared over 50,000 times across social media platforms. Comments poured in from readers across the country, each one expressing outrage at Greg's manipulation and overwhelming support for my fight to reclaim my daughter. "This is happening in my family too," wrote one woman from Texas. "Thank you for showing me that I'm not crazy, that what I'm seeing is real abuse." Another comment from a man in Oregon read, "My mother went through something similar with my sister's husband. I wish we had fought as hard as Dorothy did." The messages kept coming hour after hour from strangers who recognized our story in their own lives. My phone rang constantly with calls from local television stations requesting interviews. National elder abuse organizations reached out wanting to feature my story in their awareness campaigns. The Tribune's editor called to tell me they had received more reader response to Robert's article than any story they had published in the past 5 years. Most touching of all were the messages from people I hadn't heard from in decades. My nursing school roommate called from Florida, tears in her voice, as she told me she had always known I was one of the strongest people she'd ever met. Former colleagues from the hospital reached out sharing memories of my advocacy for patients and expressing their outrage that anyone would dare question my character or competence. But it was Mrs. Henderson's visit that morning that truly showed me how completely the tide had turned. She knocked on my door carrying a casserole and an expression of profound shame. "Dorothy, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," she said, her voice breaking. "I believed those awful lies about you, and I'm so ashamed. You've been nothing but kind and competent for all the years I've known you. I should have trusted my own eyes instead of listening to that woman's poison." The vindication felt like sunlight after months of living in shadows, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Greg wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and his response proved that assessment correct within hours of the article's publication. His first desperate move was to hire a lawyer and threaten the Tribune with a defamation lawsuit. But Robert had been in investigative journalism for 40 years, and every fact in his article was meticulously documented. The lawyer's threatening letter was quickly dismissed by the newspaper's legal team, who pointed out that truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. When legal intimidation failed, Greg's tactics became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. He began posting frantic messages on social media, claiming I was a master manipulator who had somehow fabricated evidence and brainwashed an entire community. He accused Robert of being part of a conspiracy against him, suggesting that I had paid the Tribune to publish lies. Most disturbingly, he attempted to force Lisa to publicly defend him and discredit me. According to Robert's sources, neighbors had reported hearing screaming arguments from their apartment, with Greg's voice clearly audible as he demanded Lisa make public statements supporting his version of events. But Lisa was no longer the compliant partner in his narrative. The psychological earthquake Dr. Sharma had predicted was happening in real time, and Lisa was struggling to reconcile the documented evidence of Greg's manipulation with the reality she had been living. Friends who tried to contact her reported that she sounded confused and distressed, her voice lacking the cheerful confidence that had characterized her social media posts. The most heartbreaking evidence of Lisa's internal struggle came through a detail that Robert uncovered through his careful monitoring. Lisa had apparently called my number 3 times in the week following the article's publication, but each call had been disconnected before it could ring through. She had also drafted several emails to my address, but none had been sent. The technology trail showed a daughter desperately trying to reach out to her mother, but unable to overcome the psychological barriers that had been built around her mind. Karen's attempts to defend herself and Greg only accelerated her social destruction. She appeared on a local radio call-in show, attempting to discredit the article by repeating her lies about my supposed mental decline. But callers immediately challenged her claims, pointing out the documented medical evidence that proved my competence. The host, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's increasingly frantic accusations, eventually cut her off mid-sentence. At the grocery store, where she had once held court spreading malicious gossip, Karen now found herself completely isolated. Former friends crossed to different aisles to avoid her. The pharmacist, who had known both of us for years, loudly refused to fill her prescription while other customers watched, saying he couldn't serve someone who had spread such cruel lies about a respected member of the community. Within a week of the article's publication, Karen had packed her belongings and left town, unable to face the community that now knew the truth about her character. Her parting gesture was as petty and vindictive as everything else she had done. She left anonymous flyers in several mailboxes, still trying to spread lies about my mental state, but residents immediately recognized her handwriting and reported the harassment to the police. Greg's desperation reached its peak when he hired a private investigator to try to find dirt on Robert and me, hoping to discredit the article by attacking its sources. But 40 years of ethical journalism and nursing left little ammunition for character assassination. The investigator's report, which Robert obtained through his own sources, concluded that both of our reputations were unassailable and that any attempt to discredit us would likely backfire spectacularly. As I watched Greg's increasingly frantic attempts to control the narrative, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. This was the man my daughter had chosen over me, a man whose response to being exposed was not remorse or self-reflection, but desperate attempts to destroy anyone who threatened his control. But most importantly, I could see that his hold over Lisa was finally breaking. Every desperate move he made, every public tantrum and wild accusation was showing her the true nature of the man she had sacrificed her family to be with. The facade was crumbling, and the real Greg Morrison was being revealed in all his manipulative, controlling ugliness. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after Robert's article had shattered their carefully constructed world. According to what Lisa would later tell me, Greg had been drinking heavily and ranting about the conspiracy against him when his phone rang. It was his lawyer calling with devastating news. The district attorney's office had opened a formal investigation into elder abuse charges based on the documented evidence in Robert's article and the flood of complaints from community members who now understood the systematic nature of Greg's campaign against me. The audio recordings in particular provided clear evidence of psychological manipulation and financial exploitation through coercion. Lisa watched from across their apartment as Greg's face went white during the phone call. When he hung up, he turned to her with a rage she had never seen before, his mask finally slipping completely. "This is all your fault," he screamed, his voice distorted with fury. "If you had just cut ties cleanly, instead of being weak and emotional, none of this would have happened. Your pathetic mother has destroyed everything we built together." That moment, Lisa later told me through tears, was when she finally saw him clearly. Not the charming man who had promised her freedom and happiness, but the controlling manipulator who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used for his own purposes. The spell was broken, and 37 years of a mother's love came flooding back into her consciousness. She didn't respond to his rage. Instead, she quietly walked to their bedroom, packed a single suitcase with her most essential belongings, and left while he was still screaming about lawyers and conspiracies. She drove to a hotel near the airport and sat in the parking lot for 3 hours, staring at her phone and trying to find the courage to call me. Instead, she called Dr. Sharma's office, having found the number in one of the articles about my case. Through tears and stammering words, she managed to explain who she was and asked if Dr. Sharma would be willing to help her contact her mother. "I think I've made a terrible mistake," she whispered into the phone. "I think I've hurt the person who loved me most in the world, and I don't know how to fix it." Dr. Sharma, with the compassion that had made her so effective in her practice, immediately agreed to facilitate the contact. She called me that evening, her voice gentle but excited. "Dorothy, I have someone here who very much wants to talk to you. She's scared and ashamed, but she's ready to hear the truth. Are you prepared for this conversation?" My hands shook as I took the phone, and then I heard a voice I thought I might never hear again. "Mom." Lisa's voice was small and broken, like a child calling out in the darkness. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I think I've done something terrible. Can you ever forgive me?" The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. Through tears and long silences, Lisa listened as I played her the complete audio recordings, showing her the systematic way Greg had manipulated her thoughts and emotions. She heard her own voice expressing doubts and concerns, then watched how Greg had skillfully redirected those doubts toward me instead of toward him. I showed her my medical records, the proof of my competence that directly contradicted everything Greg and Karen had told her about my supposed decline. Most importantly, I told her about the blood transfusion, about how my blood had saved her life when she was 6 years old, and how that same daughter had been convinced that I was a burden she needed to escape. "I remember that surgery," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never knew you almost died to save me. He told me you were being manipulative when you talked about your sacrifices for me. He said healthy families don't use guilt as a weapon. But you weren't using guilt, were you? You were just telling me the truth about how much you loved me." The legal consequences for Greg unfolded swiftly. Once Lisa agreed to cooperate with the investigation, the district attorney's office built a comprehensive case around the audio evidence, my medical records, and Lisa's testimony about the systematic isolation and financial exploitation. Greg was charged with elder abuse conspiracy to commit fraud and criminal manipulation of a vulnerable adult. His lawyer tried to argue that the recordings were inadmissible, but the court ruled that they were legally obtained in my own home during conversations I was party to. His attempts to claim that Lisa was an adult who made her own choices fell apart when Dr. Sharma testified about the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques he had employed. The civil lawsuit I filed with my attorney's help was even more devastating. Greg was ordered to pay restitution for the second mortgage I had taken out to save their home, plus damages for emotional distress and defamation. The court also issued a permanent restraining order, forbidding him from any contact with Lisa or me. Karen, meanwhile, faced her own legal consequences. The defamation lawsuit I filed against her for her systematic campaign of lies resulted in a judgment that would follow her for years. More importantly, her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that she was forced to relocate to another state where she would have to rebuild her life under the shadow of what she had done. But the most important breakthrough was Lisa's decision to move back to our home state and begin the long process of healing from the psychological manipulation she had endured. Dr. Sharma recommended a therapist who specialized in recovery from coercive control, and Lisa threw herself into the work of understanding how she had been systematically turned against the mother who had loved her unconditionally for 37 years. "I feel like I'm waking up from a nightmare," she told me during one of our long conversations. "Everything I thought I knew about our relationship, about you, about what was good for me, it was all twisted around until I couldn't tell truth from lies anymore. I'm so ashamed of what I said to you, of how I abandoned you when you needed me most." The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months, we were walking it together. The day Lisa moved back home was both the happiest and most emotionally complex day of my life. She arrived on a sunny Saturday morning in April, driving a rented truck with everything she had left after extracting herself from the life she had built with Greg. Most of her belongings had been left behind, along with the woman she had become under his influence. I watched from my front window as she sat in the truck for several minutes, gathering courage before approaching the house where she had grown up. When she finally knocked on the door, we stood looking at each other for a long moment, both of us changed by the ordeal we had survived. "Hi, Mom," she said simply, and then we were in each other's arms, crying for all the lost months and the pain we had both endured. The hug felt different than before, tinged with a new awareness of how fragile and precious our relationship truly was. The process of rebuilding trust was neither quick nor simple. Dr. Sharma had warned us both that recovery from psychological manipulation takes time, and that Lisa would need space to rediscover her own thoughts and feelings without external pressure. Some days were harder than others, particularly when Lisa would suddenly remember something cruel she had said or done under Greg's influence. "I kept a list in my phone of all the ways you were being unreasonable," she confessed one evening as we worked together in the garden she had loved as a child. "He had me documenting every time you asked for help or expressed worry about me teaching me to see love as manipulation. I can't believe I fell for it so completely." I learned to bite my tongue when my first instinct was to reassure her that it wasn't her fault, understanding that she needed to process her own anger and shame at her own pace. Dr. Sharma taught me that the most loving thing I could do was to allow Lisa the time and space to heal without trying to manage her emotions for her. The legal resolution of Greg's case provided a measure of justice that felt profoundly satisfying. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison for elder abuse and financial exploitation, followed by 3 years of probation. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the gravity of his crimes against both Lisa and me. "Mr. Morrison, you systematically destroyed a family through calculated psychological manipulation," Judge Roberts said from the bench. "You isolated a daughter from her loving mother through lies and emotional abuse, and you targeted an elderly woman for financial exploitation. This court finds your actions particularly egregious because of the trust that was placed in you by both victims." Greg's attempts to minimize his crimes or blame others for his situation fell on deaf ears. The audio evidence was too clear, the pattern of manipulation too obvious, the damage too severe for any judge or jury to ignore. When he was led away in handcuffs, I felt not triumph, but relief that his ability to hurt other families had been curtailed. The civil judgment against him was equally comprehensive. In addition to full restitution for the financial exploitation, he was ordered to pay damages for emotional distress that would follow him for decades. His assets were seized, his business reputation destroyed, and his professional licenses revoked. The man who had once seemed so powerful and in control was left with nothing but the consequences of his own choices. Karen's fate was perhaps even more fitting. Unable to find employment or social acceptance in her new state, she was forced to take a series of menial jobs while living in a small apartment that was a far cry from the comfortable life she had enjoyed while spreading her malicious lies. Mutual acquaintances who occasionally encountered her reported that she looked bitter and aged, consumed by resentment, but unable to blame anyone but herself for her circumstances. But the most meaningful resolution was the slow, careful rebuilding of my relationship with Lisa. We established new traditions to replace the memories that had been tainted by Greg's manipulation. Sunday morning coffee became our sacred time when we would sit on the front porch and talk about anything and everything without the pressure of addressing our recent trauma. Lisa threw herself into therapy, with the same determination she had once applied to her studies. She worked to understand not just what had been done to her, but why she had been vulnerable to Greg's manipulation in the first place. She explored her own patterns of seeking approval and avoiding conflict, recognizing how Greg had exploited those tendencies. I think I was so afraid of being alone that I was willing to accept his version of reality rather than trust my own instincts, she explained during one of our evening walks. He made me feel like questioning him meant I was being disloyal, and I was so desperate to belong somewhere that I chose loyalty to him over loyalty to myself and to you, too. 6 months after her return, Lisa surprised me by asking if she could move back into her childhood bedroom temporarily while she figured out her next steps. "I need to remember who I was before Greg," she said. "I need to find that girl again and see if she can grow into the woman I'm supposed to be." Living together again wasn't always easy. We were both different people than we had been before the crisis, marked by experiences that had tested us in ways we never expected. But there was also a new depth to our relationship, a recognition of how much we meant to each other and how precious our bond truly was. The community that had rallied around me during the crisis continued to embrace Lisa as she healed. The writing workshop welcomed her with open arms, and she began exploring her own stories through poetry and prose. Robert became a mentor to her, teaching her about the power of truth and the importance of standing up to manipulation and abuse. Most importantly, Lisa began using her experience to help other families facing similar manipulation. She started speaking at Dr. Sharma's support groups, sharing her story of recovery and offering hope to other adult children who were struggling to break free from controlling relationships. "I can't change what I did to you," she told me one evening as we looked through old photo albums together. "But I can make sure that our pain serves a purpose by helping other families avoid what we went through. Maybe that's how we turn this tragedy into something meaningful." The woman who had once called me a burden was now my strongest advocate and closest ally in the fight against the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed us both. 2 years have passed since that devastating phone call that shattered my world, and I find myself living a life I could never have imagined during those dark months of isolation and despair. My mornings begin with coffee on the front porch, often joined by Lisa when she visits on weekends from her new apartment across town, where she's rebuilding her independence on her own terms. The writing workshop that introduced me to Robert and Dr. Sharma has become a cornerstone of my weekly routine. We've expanded beyond our original small group, welcoming other seniors who have survived various forms of family trauma and manipulation. I've discovered a gift for storytelling that I never knew I possessed, and more importantly, I've found purpose in helping others recognize and resist the kind of psychological abuse that nearly cost me my daughter. Lisa and I have learned that healing is not a destination, but a journey. There are still difficult days when the memories of our separation surface unexpectedly, when we're both reminded of the time we lost and the trust that had to be rebuilt stone by stone. But those moments are balanced by deeper appreciation for what we have now. Our relationship is different than before, marked by a hard-won wisdom about the fragility of family bonds and the vigilance required to protect them. The legal consequences for Greg and Karen served their purpose, but the real victory was never about punishment. It was about truth, about the power of love to overcome even the most sophisticated manipulation, and about the strength that emerges when someone refuses to accept defeat. I learned that resilience isn't about avoiding pain, but about facing it with dignity and finding ways to transform suffering into strength. Most profoundly, I discovered that my worth as a mother, as a woman, as a human being was never dependent on anyone else's recognition or approval. The love I had given Lisa for 37 years was real and valuable, regardless of whether she was able to see it clearly. The life I had built through decades of service and sacrifice had meaning that no amount of gossip or manipulation could diminish. Today, as I tend the garden where Lisa and I now work together on weekends, I understand that some storms make us stronger, not because they're easy to weather, but because they teach us who we really are when everything else is stripped away. I am a woman who saved her daughter's life twice, once with my blood and once with my refusal to give up on the truth. That knowledge brings a peace that no one can ever take from me again.